Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be joined by investigative renowned reporter Greg Palast as he talks with us about his book, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, which has also been turned into a documentary. We'll learn about our political landscape and economic crisis of globalization and corporate cons and high finance fraudsters. He sees all this corruption that is an inevitable outcome of American racism. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Greg Palast. Greg, thank you for being on the program today.
Glad to be with you.
You know, it's probably very eye-opening when people either read your book or see this documentary about what's actually been going on out there in the world of not just elections, but how money really seems to tentacleize itself into the grassroots of everything that we seem to believe in.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think one of the problems that we have now is that we have a nation of billionaires gone wild. And I'm not including the president because I'm not sure he's actually a billionaire. But the real billionaires have rewritten the rules and the laws and have even taken away, worked very hard to take away our right to vote for a simple reason. There's not a lot of them, and there's an awful lot of us. So if you have a democracy, the billionaires are not going to call the shots. The public will. So this is one of our biggest problems right now is we have some really rich guys, not the ones you've necessarily heard of, but, now lately we've heard about the Koch brothers. I write about them in The Best Democracy Money Can Buy and in the film. The people, the Koch brothers, and now it's just Charles who's alive. But there are people like Paul the Vulture Singer, John Paulson, the foreclosure king, who is our Secretary of Treasury's partner in one of the biggest foreclosure scams where people were wrongly thrown out of their houses, and these guys made billions. And I don't mean for their companies. I mean they personally made billions. Paul Singer is worth from $3 to $7 billion. John Paulson, who crashed the mortgage market in coordination with Goldman Sachs, he personally made $5 billion in a single year. No one's ever made that much money since the pharaohs. And so you've got some billionaires who are calling the shots, and as you say, they kind of use, I wouldn't say that they're racist, these billionaires, like Paul the Vulture Singer, John Paulson, Steve Mnuchin, the Koch brothers. I wouldn't say they're racist at all. They use race. They use race as a weapon to get the policies that they want and to exclude the voters that they fear.
Now let's talk about how they go about doing this.
Okay. Well, for example, we had in the film The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, which, by the way, is available free on Prime for those who have that. And there's also, if you go to gregpalast.com, by the way, you can get a shorter activist or church-friendly version, which the Reverend Jesse Jackson commissioned, and where the language is church-friendly or school-friendly. But one of the things that we took on is a system called interstate cross-check, which cost the votes of over 1 million. Let me repeat that. 1 million legal voters lost their right to vote because they are identified on a list as having voted twice in the same election in two different states, or, which is a crime, go to jail crime, or registered in two states. Now, so they were removed from the voter rolls. You say, well, no one should be allowed to vote in two states. I agree. But no one does. They don't have people arrested for this crime because you go to 5 years in the can. So how could they possibly identify 1 million people and remove them for voting twice when it's a crime that doesn't happen? The answer is they simply matched common names: John Brown, James Brown, Jose Rodriguez, Gloria Chung, for example. And what you have is they said, okay, if we found someone named James Brown, they found 535 guys named James Brown in Georgia, for example. Believe it or not, they found a James Brown in Arizona and in Motown and in Maryland and in Nebraska and in Kansas. So every time they found a James Brown, they said, oh, that's the same voter. And, well, except that the middle names, I got a hold of the actual lists. if you know Greg Palast, I'm an investigative reporter. I actually got the list. Other journalists didn't bother getting the list. I got the list. And they said James Thomas Brown was the same voter as James Edward Brown. James Brown Jr. is the same voter as James Brown Sr. And you get the idea. They're knocking off all these people. And the reason why it's racial is that 85 of the 100 most common names in America, Johnson, Black, Rodriguez, Hernandez, Ho, Kim, these names, 85 of the 100 most common last names in America are minority names. So they know when they use this kind of nonsense common name algorithm to find double voters that they're knocking off voters of color. They know it.
And it turns out, too, it was the same way with the Asian community, correct?
Yes. Well, the Asian community, I went into the Korean community in Georgia, where, as you know, Stacey Abrams was running for governor, the first black woman in American history to run for governor. And she should have won. Oh, she did won by the votes, but except they knocked off so many voters off the voter rolls that her Republican opponent, who is a Secretary of State, who knocked them off. That's what did it there. So what's happened is that so it's had a tremendous effect on elections such as in Georgia and even the 2016 election. Trump, if it weren't for these games, Trump would not be president. And I'm not talking about the popular vote. He didn't win Michigan. He didn't win Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Iowa or Arizona. It was only because of these removals of voters of color that you had this unexpected outcome.
Now, what was really eye-opening is sort of the systematic way they go about discounting voters. In other words, removing them from the list by a simple mailer that, if it was to come back, basically says, well, their address A is now null and void, but now they're no longer eligible to vote.
Yes, this is the newest trick that I'm working on right now. In fact, with Stacey Abrams' organization, which is called Fair Fight, in Georgia and in about 20 other states, they want to remove you from the voter rolls. Say, oh, you've missed an election, or you have a name similar to someone who's been deported. That's another good gimmick. Or James Brown. There's another James Brown in another state. So they send you a postcard. If you don't return that postcard, you lose your right to vote. You say, well, what's the big deal? Well, the answer is it's a very big deal, and it's a very racial deal. Because if you are registered to vote and you registered because you're living in an apartment building, over a 10-year period, you're likely to have moved in that neighborhood to another apartment building. The renters move around, and you won't get that card. Now, understand, you do not have to re-register, and you should never lose your vote simply because you've moved down the street. If you stay within your county, you are not, under federal law, required to re-register. Yet that all these renters were losing their right to vote because they'd moved. We had a case of a woman in Georgia who lost her right to vote because she moved within an apartment building and didn't get her little card. The truth is, if you're a black, young, urban renter, you're 600% less likely to get and return a postcard than a white, suburban, older homeowner. It's that simple. Those statistics come from the Census Bureau, which, of course, is very interested in responses to the census requests. So they know that using postcards is just another dumb, racist trick to remove low-income and voters of color and also students who move around quite a bit.
Now, what motivates these billionaires, so people get a better perspective of why they go about taking our democracy?
Well, it's not that they're Republicans or Democrats. Billionaires are for billionaires. I found that with the Koch brothers, with this one guy, for example, Paul the Vulture Singer, John Paulson, these guys have floated between parties. Right now, they're Republicans because they think that Republicans give them the best tax breaks, etc. But, for example, in the case of now these are guys. Well, David just passed away, but David and Charles are each about $40 billion. What did they want? They wanted a president who would approve the XL pipeline, the pipeline that would take tar sands oil from Canada, run it across the United States, and send it to their refineries on the Gulf Coast of Texas. Now you'd say, well, why can't they use Texas oil if they're in Texas? The answer is these are special refineries that are owned by these billionaires. They own the whole refinery, and they can't use Texas oil. They have to use oil from Venezuela, which is charged a lot, or Canada, which is cheap. They get that pipeline, and these brothers earn $1 billion each, even though it's the filthiest oil on the planet. It fries our planet and endangers our water supply by running oil pipes across the entire width of the United States of America. And so that's just what these guys want. I know that Paul the Vulture Singer, and I didn't give him that name. He's known as a vulture investor. He was pushing Trump. Trump said he would close a loophole used by the Vulture and other billionaires called carried interest. That loophole is worth over $1 billion to one single billionaire, John Paulson. Paulson was one of the biggest funders of the Trump campaign, and Trump backed off his promise to close that tax loophole because that would have hit his big supporters, the Vulture, John Paulson, Steve Mnuchin, his Secretary of Treasury, Wilbur Ross, who is his Commerce Secretary. These are real billionaires, and that tax loophole is worth more than $1 billion to each of them personally. So that's what they want. That's what they want, and they need a president who will do their bidding.
Now, speaking of the Vulture, I remember that there's a part in your documentary that talks about this individual and the Congo and water. Let's talk about because what blows my mind is that you see a lot of this going on in different ways. To give you an idea, some time ago we did a wonderful segment on two brothers who actually created baby food that was the first natural holistic baby food available on the market, called Earth's Best. And as I was reading their story, in this book they were talking about how they were about to get a good significant amount of funding that would have really gotten the factory off the ground, got them into production, and gotten this food onto the shelves, which fortunately the food is on the shelves this day and age. But what was interesting about this whole setup for them to get this funding is that they had to hire this one specific guy to be their president. He steps in, the money basically disappears, they never got it, and then he stepped down and went off into the sunset somewhere. And this is the kind of crap that goes on quite regularly, that all of a sudden this guy comes in, they set up this deal, he shaves all the money off the top, much as like I'm sure you're about to share about this Congo story, and then waltzes off into the sunset. Another example was disaster relief for a place in India where there were people who came from around the world, volunteered their time and their experience and skills to try to help rebuild this town. In the meantime, there were these funded charity efforts to, collect funds to be able to help with this effort. Now, these were people that were bringing their own effort, their own blood, sweat, and tears to this whole thing, not being paid anything. They were given their time for a period of about 3 to 6 months and just burning out. And the villagers weren't really doing much. They were kind of standing by until some of the money started coming in, and then all of a sudden they felt entitled to all this. Quick story short, more than $1 billion was raised for relief effort for this particular area here that was damaged, and they never seen a dime of it. Where did the money go?
Well, and that's one of these stories, in fact, with these billionaires. In fact, I wrote a book called Billionaires and Ballot Ban that's relating the vote theft to the billionaires. But also you'll see in the film, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. Again, it's free on Prime. But it's we have scenes where I go to the Congo, where this Paul the Vulture Singer, this guy, seized control of the debts owed by the Congo during a civil war. This is the Republic of Congo. There are two nations named Congo. And the Republic of Congo was in a civil war. They had a cholera epidemic. The nation was completely broke. So the United States Treasury, originally under George Bush, by the way, who wanted to help Africa, that was one of his things, the United States Treasury and the European Union and the nations of Europe said, okay, we're going to help pay off some of the debts of the Congo. But not at a full price, because people were buying up, speculators were buying up the Congo's debts during its war for like 10 cents on the dollar. So if a bond is supposed to pay off $1,000, you buy it for $100, right? Because most people thought it was worthless. But once our government and the European government said we would help the Congo by paying off their debts and then give them money to clean their water, to end the cholera epidemic, this guy, the vulture, swoops in, buys the bonds, and says, I own all your resources. And if anyone gives you money for fixing up your water systems, then that's my money. If anyone wants to give you money to pay off your old debts, that's my money. And I'm going to get, and even though I only paid $10 million, I want $200 million. I want $200 million. So he paid $10 million and ended up with this nation. My understanding is they paid, like somewhere between $50 and $100 million. He made like a 500,000% profit, this vulture, off of the good intentions of the people of the United States and Europe, and that was money that was taken away from improving the water system and ending a cholera epidemic. I was there in the Congo. I saw these kids with cholera, sick kids with the distended bellies, and you can't imagine anything more horrific than a parent watching their kid die from cholera, and yet this guy didn't care.
Right. And it's also by the same token as you were talking about Polson earlier, it was funny in the documentary to see a face-to-face with this guy, on a nice, rich soiree. And I thought to myself, when you tend to see journalists get this close and up and personal in situations like this, usually you read about them in obituaries. So my question is, how do you manage to stay away from all that?
People are always, I do kind of things that other people and other journalists would consider somewhat dangerous. I'm probably alive because I'm kind of a coward. I try to make sure I don't get gunned down. But for example, there is a scene in the film where I actually got myself into this $1,000 a plate dinner with several billionaires. Several billionaires are in that room. And one was the foreclosure king, the guy who had literally was behind 1 million people losing their homes. 1 million people. He personally made billions off foreclosures, of the worst tragedy in American history in terms of since the Great Depression.
And he did that to make sure that he could get his mortgage paid, I'm guessing. So he wasn't one of the million, right?
So I said, so I confront him. I said, well, there's all these, I'd met people who lost their homes, families who lost their homes. In the film, you meet some. So I asked this billionaire, I confront him, I say, well, listen, why don't you let these people that you foreclose on their homes, why can't they stay in your home in Vail where you have 70 bedrooms? You're never there. How about your place in Puerto Rico with 200 bedrooms? You're not there. He's got the biggest home in all of New York City, physically the biggest home, and then another on Long Island. You see in the film, I use drones to fly over his homes. And, so like, why can't you put the homeless there? He has like 6 homes, and together they have about 400 bedrooms.
Wow.
And yet he's putting people out of their houses. And when you see this kind of raw greed, and then also he even, I don't know whether he's lying to me or lying to himself, but he and his vulture buddies closed down General Motors auto parts division, Delco, which is now called Delphi. And they bought that up and sent every single union job to China. Every single union job, 30 plants were shifted to China. And he told me, oh, no, we still have 35,000 people here in the United States in that company. Well, I looked it up. They told the Securities Exchange Commission that they now only have 5,000 people in the U.S., mostly salesmen, and they have 122,000 people, jobs that they've created overseas, moving those jobs out. They don't care, and they need a president that will endorse this. So while, look, Donald Trump gives a big speech, I'm going to end the billionaires' loopholes. He didn't. I'm going to make the billionaires bring those plants back that they sent overseas. No, he didn't. Why didn't he do that? Because they own him. They own him. Now, I won't say they don't own parts of the Democratic Party too, but they own Trump. Wilbur Ross, Steve Mnuchin, John Paulson, Paul the Vulture Singer, these are people who, let's put it this way. Donald Trump only plays a billionaire on TV. He needs their money to get elected and to get reelected. It's really that simple.
And it kind of begs the question, if it's that big, what are people able to do about it?
Plenty.
Okay.
You know what? Like I say, there's only so many billionaires, and there's more of us. It's 99% versus 1%. And the truth is they can't steal all the votes all the time. I've told you about tricks that they use. But as you know, Barack Obama got elected overcoming, I did a story for Rolling Stone, and if you see in the film too, you'll understand this. Barack Obama was elected even though 5.9 million votes and voters were disqualified. That is, we had 2 million, 3 million ballots disqualified on goofy technical reasons, almost all of them cast by voters of color. And second, you had about almost 3 million people removed from the voter rolls who were really legitimate voters. Tricks like in Florida calling people felons, ex-cons who can't vote, when in fact I got their list and there was no one on that list not one person on their list of 58,000 people who they removed as felons were in fact ex-con voters. And so it's a game that they play, and they're black voters. I'm not guessing because it says BLA next to their name. BLA is marked under federal law next to your name. Your race is on those voter rolls, and they know who they're removing. So, but you can't steal all the votes all the time. Obama just simply rolled over them.
Right, exactly. Now, here's something I'd like to talk about because I know my wife has been following this pretty diligently, and that's the fires that seem to be erupting in the state of California, and
Yes.
She keeps showing. Do you notice that it's weird that you've got a straight line going on here? So I know that you've been heavily involved in the PG&E situation.
Yes.
So what's really going on here with California perhaps and PG&E in general?
Okay. Well, it's the old story of greed.
It is.
It's follow the money. People talk about global warming, they talk about fires and da-da-da. It still comes down to the money. It's real simple. California is divided in two in terms of its electric system. In most of the state and in the north, you have a private company, Pacific Gas and Electric, which is now in bankruptcy. That's because they took all the money that they were given to fix up the system, to stop it from catching fire. Basically the Kincaid fire happened because, which is currently burning in Sonoma County. It's happening because a transmission line's jumper cable popped off and sparked the forest fire in Sonoma. Now you have to understand, PG&E was told more than 2 years ago to fix this line. And they promised to fix the line, and they were given money by the ratepayers. It's like a budget that they get when they charge you your electric bill. They get a budget from operations and maintenance, and that line was supposed to be fixed by April. They didn't, and so now in beginning of November and the end of October, that line set off massive fires. And then they had a transformer blowout last year, and 85 people were burnt to death. They had a gas pipe that blew up in San Bruno because they didn't use the proper diagnostic equipment. All of that has led them, because they were constantly skimming on the money, constantly. So you have this private company which is controlling, basically has Northern California by the bulbs. You have no choice of electric systems. There's no such thing as a market in electricity. You got one wire going into your house. And you are stuck with a system that's really, in Northern California, the richest metropolitan area on this planet, the richest, and yet they have an electric system worthy of third world. Whereas in Los Angeles, I'm calling you from L.A., we have a greater fire danger down here because we have more drought, more dryness, and very little rain. And yet we don't have we have big fires, but we don't have the same devastating fires, and we don't have, or the people dead, and we don't have massive blackouts because the system has many, many sensors all over the Los Angeles area. If we have to turn off because of high winds, we have to turn off some areas of power. It's very local. Why is that? The answer is because In Los Angeles, we have the Department of Water and Power. It is owned by the government. And so we pay the government for our electricity and water. And when things go wrong, the mayor himself, I just saw Mayor Garcetti of Los Angeles on TV explaining why we had a tiny fire near, in the city, near the Getty Museum. And he was out there explaining it and, why this can stop and what we can do about it and why there's, we're not shutting off everyone's electricity like in the north. The difference is when you have a publicly owned system, you're removing the greed factor.
Right. Huh. That's, it's funny because I was also just showing her last night The Smartest Guys in the Room, the Enron scandal.
Exactly.
And so it's really funny to piece and see all of these different elements together. And again, the biggest thing is it leaves you sometimes scratching your head thinking this seems so big. What could I do about this?
Well,
and
right.
obviously you're somebody who not only exposes what the problem is, why it became the problem that it did, but at the same time you provide solutions as well.
Well, there's a couple good solutions. You mentioned Enron. Enron, by the way, is the reason why they have fires now is because Ken Lay, who is the chairman and CEO of Enron, who's now dead, and he was found guilty of racketeering. Basically, Enron was a criminal enterprise parading as a power company. And it was Enron that convinced the state of California to be the first state in America to deregulate the electric system. So California went first over the deregulation cliff. And what that meant is, they say deregulation. I call it decriminalizing skimming from the maintenance budgets. Used to be, when you get your power bill, part of it is determined by a state agency which says the company needs X dollars to maintain and repair the system. Now, in the old days, that was their budget, and they had to spend it. Now, if they don't spend it, they say, oh, look how efficient we were. We were able to save money, and they get to pocket that money. Well, they're not being efficient. They're being greedy and pocketing the money, and then, of course, when you don't maintain the system, after 10, 15, 20 years, they're pocketing the money for 10, 15, 20 years, and then after 20 years, suddenly they reap the whirlwind. In other words, then the fires break out, and now they're liable for all the fires, and they have to pay, so they're in bankruptcy court because they pocketed all that money before, and it went to their executives, it went to their stockholders, it went to the banks who were cranking them with high interest. So everyone was making out except the poor customers who picked up the bill and now have to literally pick up the pieces with thousands of homes burnt.
Now, and also, as I'm on your website, which I encourage people to go to, gregpalast.com, we'll get that spelled out before the show's over with, but apparently there's also a possibility this rolling blackout, these fires are also therefore possibly blackmailing the judge that's overseeing their bankruptcy case?
Well, yeah, that's one of the oldest tricks in the world, is that, utility companies like to flick the switches on and off to scare you, right? Now, in the case of PG&E, there's no question they have a dangerous system. So, you're kind of caught. You don't want them. You shouldn't. Electric systems aren't supposed to kill. They're supposed to keep the lights on and not kill you, their customers, right? PG&E's failed on both counts. So what's happened is that, so they say, look, we have high winds in Northern California. Well, no kidding. This is not new. This is not something that just happened this year. This has been for centuries. High winds in Northern California in those mountains, and they've got these unsecured wires running through the air, and so they're saying, and transformers which are not protected from the surrounding brush, and so they say, we have to turn off literally over 1 million customers. Over 1 million customers lose their power, and that means your oxygen machine, everything, your refrigerator is gone. Businesses, supermarkets lose everything. They go out of business, and they say, we have to do that because with these high winds we could lose more lines, because we didn't repair them, and we lose more lines, we'll have more fires. But I think that they went with the wide swath business to try to shake down the government and the bankruptcy judge for more money. They want to scare. They're in bankruptcy court, and they want to scare the judge into saying, you got to give us a lot of money and keep us in charge, otherwise the lights are going to stay out. And I think that They are not taking the steps that could reduce the amount of blackouts, which is a quick laying of meteorological equipment as we have in Southern California. You need the wind machines, you need and the sensors all over the system, which they don't have, and they should put that in immediately and stop flicking our light switches.
I know that I've said a couple of times through the program, what can people do? And I wanted to point out one of the movies that you can find on Greg's website is The Yes Men. And I love those guys. I think I've seen, there's a total of 3 documentaries on these guys, and I've seen the second one first, which was The Yes Men Save the World. And it was pretty comical to realize how at a very simple level these guys did what they did to basically garner and draw attention to, corruption and things that are going on out there in the world. And,
that's right.
And, so I encourage people to take a look at that, to see what these guys do. And how did you come to learn about them real quick?
Well, the Yes Men, I've worked with them. What they do is they take some of my investigations and then turn them into kind of humorous stunts.
But they're effective.
A good way to get it out. I actually did work. If you watch my film, if you watch like The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, you read my book, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, you see that I use a lot of humor because it's a grim story.
It is.
But I try to make it so that there's some humor, so that you're not crying through the whole thing, and frankly to try to keep the films and the books entertaining, so that you get the information and not suffer. So I love working with the Yes Men, and in England I was a reporter for BBC Television, but I was also a writer for the Mark Thomas Comedy Hour, basically doing taking my investigative reports and turning them into humor, because I think one of the things we can do is that the billionaires hate is when you make fun of them, when you laugh at them. If you make them like monstrous, terrible, superhuman villains that we can't defeat, then you're discouraged. But if you realize that they're actually quite silly people, they're just super rich, but they're mostly pretty silly. Like in the film, I show John Paulson, this guy who picked up $5 billion in a single year, and he was paying top tennis pros to play tennis with them, but they were paid to lose.
Right, so that they could have the trophies.
so the billionaires could get a trophy. So you got these great tennis players. I know even my friend John McEnroe, the great tennis player, he would lose to these guys because he knew that's the trick. They pay you like $100,000 to play tennis with them. They expect you to lose, and it's all and so these people are really silly. Mm-hmm. And that's what I tried to show. And there's things you can do. For example, let's talk about electricity and voting. In electricity, the city of San Jose has said, okay, enough with these private greedsters. Let's have a public takeover of the system in Northern California of PG&E. The public's paying anyway, so let's own it, cut the bills, and harden the system so it's not burning down the state. That's number one. And by the way, I did that. I worked for the state of New York. 30 years ago, we took over a gigantic electric company that was also out of control, just like PG&E, called Long Island Lighting, LOCO. And the state of New York, the customers bought the utility cheap. We just made a hostile takeover bid, just like Gordon Gekko in Wall Street. Mm-hmm. And we took over the power company. And it's almost as big, by the way, as PG&E. It's bigger than Los Angeles coverage. It's out in New York. So you had a government takeover, and what it means is it's not like now you've got a raging socialist system. There are 47 million people are covered by government-owned and government-controlled power co-ops in America. And so it's a very just like most water systems are public, electricity systems are best public because there's a monopoly, and we should have control. Like I say, if something goes wrong, I want to be able to vote the mayor out. Mayor Garcetti in Los Angeles knows that he's responsible when there's a fire. He has to explain why it's happened, what he's doing about it. He can't say, oh, well, I can't do anything about it because my stockholders want to go along with it. The stockholders are the people. In the case of voting, there's many things you could take. Number one, you expose these things. And make sure, by the way, that you are registered. And I don't care if you've been voting in the same place 30 years. I have, if you go to my site, you will see a woman, Christine Jordan. She was 92 years old last year when she went to vote for the 50th year in a row at the same voting station. They said she could not vote, that she was no longer registered there. They took away her vote, Christine Jordan. And understand, I was there with her at the polling station. I filmed this. It's gregpowles.com. I filmed this. And this is the cousin of Martin Luther King Jr. After King would give his sermons at Ebenezer Baptist Church, he'd go over to Christine's house and her family's house for the Sunday dinner. This is Martin Luther King's cousin, voting in the same place 50 years. They took away her right to vote. Now, the trick is, check your registration. Every single state in America allows you to check your registration online. Make sure it's still there. Don't assume it. I was removed from the California voter rolls. I found some goofy, cockamamie reason, but I re-registered online. And if you're listening, and we got a particular problem of massive removals of the voter rolls from Arizona, where I know your program is based. And Arizona is a terrible state in that sense. Removing people all the time, and you don't get notice. So please check.
Absolutely. We always say, too, especially on the program, is we like to bring information, but don't just sit back passively and say, well, there it is. But, it's to give you responsibility. Do your homework. That's the biggest thing. Don't just passively say, well, I heard what these guys are saying. It makes sense. It's probably true. Go out there and use the information, do more homework and, build that strength so that you actually have more choices instead of somebody who seems to be wealthy enough to take all that away from you. And that's certainly not something you want.
And there's a few simple things. There's often early voting. Arizona and other states have early voting. Go in and vote early, in person. If you mail in a ballot, you got the problem that they can find some little thing wrong. Postage due knocks out 1 million people. Can you believe it or not? People don't realize sometimes it's 2 stamps. It's better to take your ballot in, to either take a mail-in ballot and walk it in or go and vote in person. And if you vote early, the advantage is you can, if you run into a problem like you're not registered, you can complain about it and get that fixed. But mainly try to check a month, 2 months before an election. Make sure you are registered and the people you know and care about are registered. It's simple, but it's vital. Don't assume that you're a voter just because you registered 10 years ago.
Well, and one last thing on the voter was that you had pointed out, and this was the same problem that happened during the 2000 election, is they were shutting down voting centers, and where people ended up standing in lines for 5 or 6 hours, just to vote. And that one guy, for instance, in one particular situation in your documentary, was responsible for making that decision. One guy decided to shut down all these voting centers. Who gave him the power to do that?
Well, unfortunately, we have the craziest system in America in which we have partisan officials who are in charge of the vote, where people vote, how many voting stations, et cetera. So, for example, you were right. In Florida, we remember people waiting 9 hours in line, and still Obama carried Florida because they could not discourage. It was black voters in the black precincts. And then what I saw in Ohio this time, 16, was the only reason why Donald Trump supposedly won Ohio and Michigan and a couple other states is that they basically made it incredibly difficult for African Americans to vote. In the state of Ohio, 70% of African Americans vote early. The Sunday before, they call it Souls to the Polls Day. And they go from church. And in each of the counties, the Republican Secretary of State, the guy in charge, he's a Republican, a highly partisan Republican, said there could only be one single polling station for each county. And he said, that's fair, because then every county has the same number of polling stations. Well, that meant that a county with 6,000 cows and 4 people get a polling station. The entire city of Cleveland had one polling station.
Wow.
The entire city of Cleveland had one early polling station. People were waiting 7 hours. I was in Dayton, Ohio, where there was one polling station for 80,000 people, almost all of them African American. One polling station for 80,000. And then on the Tuesday, I went to the white suburbs of Toledo, and they had polling stations everywhere, and I went to one to see what the line was, and there was no line. The line was poll workers waiting for voters, and they had coffee and cookies if you showed up to vote. The people in Dayton were in this freezing garage. They made them stand outside for 5 hours, snaking through a freezing garage. Remember, it's November in Ohio. This is like seriously below freezing. And this is the games that are being played. And this is why I've kind of, that's why I keep trying to expose this. And it's usually racial, because when you are going after black voters or Hispanic voters and now Asian American voters, you're going after vulnerable groups that don't have the political power to protect them. And in places like Ohio, they just don't care. They know that they let everyone vote, the billionaires lose. It's real simple.
Well, it's certainly eye-opening, and I know that our listeners out there will really enjoy the documentary. I did like your approach, very cartoonish, sort of,
right.
In a way like the Geek Squad and their kind of art, that sort of a thing. But you can find out more about that by visiting your website, which is gregpalast.com. Very simple to find there. Anything you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, if you go to Greg Palast, two things. All through 2020, this is Greg Palast, I will be reporting for the Guardian newspapers of Britain and the United States, Guardian USA, on we're doing a whole investigation of the fight for the right to vote in America, the fight for the vote. And so I'll be issuing reports and short films, and I'm also going to be working with Stacey Abrams in Fair Fight, Georgia. And so if you want those reports, go to gregpalast.com, GregPalast.com. And we'll also have, by the way, we have lists there. If you go to gregpalast.com, you will see lists of states where we actually have the names of people who've been purged. You can look yourself up and see if you have, it says voter purge lists, Georgia, Colorado, Indiana, Arizona, Illinois, Las Vegas, and Reno if you're in Nevada, Nebraska, and see if you're on that list of people who've lost their right to vote. Then you better re-register.
And I just wanted to bring up one more thing. It's wonderful that people like you are out there doing what you're doing, bringing this out, getting more people proactively involved, to put balance back into a system that obviously has been out of balance. But some time ago, we've had on the program now 3 times John Perkins, the economic hitman.
Yes.
And what was really encouraging about him is he's out there speaking along with others who were paid to do what this man used to do.
Yeah.
And what's really unique is he says, now when you go to the Ivy League schools, the language isn't like it used to be where everybody was motivated about how much money they can make when they get out of the institution, but they're motivated now by how much they can change and better the world. And so it's very encouraging to let listeners out there know if you think this problem is too big and out of your hands, it's actually happening. But the question is how proactive will you be now that you know what you know in being involved in making sure that this happens?
I see, we've had let's keep some perspective. And I know John Perkins well as a good friend. I wrote the intro to his book. And the one thing I will say is that we've had very successful movements. Anyone who thinks that the public can't change things, when Martin Luther King first tried to cross the bridge at Selma and was turned back, and after Bloody Sunday when people were beaten nearly to death, and then you had 4 people murdered by Klansmen on the march from Selma to Montgomery. When he started, no one believed that you could get a law, the Voting Rights Act, which would say that you can vote no matter the color of your skin. That was considered impossible. Crossed that bridge from Selma. By the time he got to Montgomery, 50 miles later, the President introduced and Congress passed that Voting Rights Act. Say that you can't do anything, that they're too powerful, is losing before you've even entered the field. There is always more. There's more of us than there are of them, and we can all make a difference.
Greg Palast, I want to thank you for being on the program today and talking with us about your book, the documentary, and things that people should be aware of so that they can take proactive action. I mean, you're in it. Once you know there's a problem, you become part of the solution, and that's just as simple as it gets.
Sounds. I'm with you there 100%. I'm glad, and I'll come back next year with the latest reports.
I'd be excited to have you back on the program. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.